Zyke was a village untouched by the storm of modernity that had ravaged the cities. Nestled in the serene hills of Plateau State, the village exuded a tranquility only found in rural life. The sun cast a golden hue over the thatched huts, and the sound of children's laughter echoed across the fields. Emeka stood in the middle of his farmland, his heart swelling with pride. The crops, cassava, maize, and yams, grew tall and thick under his tender care. He could already see the harvest in his mind, imagining how it would feed his family and provide for his community. Emeka's hands were calloused from years of hard work, but he wore them proudly. He was a farmer, a provider for his family. His wife, Bola, often teased him about being too protective of the crops. But he knew how fragile life in Zyke could be. Without the land, there would be no food, no future. And like many villagers, he was at peace with his way of life, a rhythm that never changed. Across the fields, Usman's cattle grazed lazily. Usman was a herder, respected in Zyke for his knowledge of the land and the animals he cared for. He walked slowly among the cows, watching them graze, a quiet man with an air of wisdom about him. The farmers and herders had lived side by side in relative harmony for years. Emeka had long known Usman, and despite their occasional misunderstandings over crops and cattle, they had always found a way to work things out. However, there was a new, silent tension in the air, a feeling that something was brewing. The farmers, led by Emeka, had noticed an increasing number of cattle straying into their fields, trampling over the precious crops they had worked so hard to grow. Each day, a few more crops were destroyed, and the frustration among the farmers began to build. Yet, no one dared to speak up directly. The balance of the community, fragile as it was, seemed like it could tip at any moment. As Emeka walked home that evening, with the sunset casting an orange glow over the village, he couldn't shake the sense of unease. Bola had noticed it too. She had been urging him to speak to Usman, but Emeka, always the peacemaker, hesitated. The harmony of Zyke had always been delicate, like a thin thread holding everything together. Breaking that thread, no matter how necessary, could unravel the whole community. Meanwhile, Usman walked back to his makeshift hut near the village's outskirts, unaware of the growing discontent among the farmers. His thoughts were clouded by his own troubles. The herders had always respected the land, and the farmers had understood the necessity of grazing. But lately, the fields were becoming scarce, the land shrinking as more cattle roamed farther than usual. Usman felt the pressure, not only from the farmers but also from his own people, who demanded more land for grazing. He knew something had to change, but he wasn't sure how to bridge the growing gap between the two factions. The sun had just begun to set over Zyke, casting the village in a soft, orange glow. Emeka, exhausted from a day in the fields, was walking toward his home when his eyes fell on a disturbing sight. Usman's cattle were grazing once again in the far corner of his field, and as he approached, Emeka noticed something more alarming. Some of the crops had been trampled, and a few of the young maize stalks had been destroyed. Emeka's heart sank. This had been happening more frequently over the past few weeks. The quiet tension between the farmers and herders had shifted into something more volatile, a storm ready to break. He marched toward Usman's herd with determination in his step, trying to keep his frustration in check. As Emeka approached Usman, the herder was sitting on a large rock, watching the cattle. He looked up and met Emeka's gaze. There was a flicker of something, embarrassment, guilt, or perhaps just exhaustion, in Usman's eyes. "Usman," Emeka called out sharply, "your cattle are destroying my crops again. This can't keep happening." Usman stood up slowly, his gaze shifting to the cattle, then to the damage. "I didn't let them wander too far," he replied, his voice low and apologetic. "The land is shrinking, Emeka. It's hard to keep them in one place." Emeka's frustration bubbled over. "It's not enough, Usman. This is my livelihood. We're all suffering because of this. You need to take responsibility for your cattle." Before Usman could respond, there was a sudden rustle in the bushes nearby. Both men turned sharply toward the noise, but what they saw froze them in place. A group of men, masked and armed, emerged from the trees. They were dressed in traditional herder attire, but their eyes were cold, their expressions unreadable. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar across his face, stepped forward, holding a machete. He looked at Emeka and Usman with a smirk. "We don't have time for your arguments," he said, his voice rough. "It's time for Zyke to pay." Emeka and Usman instinctively took a step back, but the leader raised a hand, signaling to his men to advance. "We've been watching you," the leader sneered. "The land is ours now. We'll take whatever we want." Before Emeka could react, the gang surged forward, knocking both men to the ground. Usman struggled to his feet, but Emeka was already grappling with one of the attackers. The attackers were swift, organized, and ruthless, causing chaos in the once peaceful village. They set fire to a nearby barn, looted what little the villagers had, and vandalized government buildings. Amid the madness, Emeka managed to crawl toward the village's church, his heart pounding. He looked behind him, searching for Usman, but the herder was nowhere to be found. Then, through the smoke and fire, Emeka saw something that made his blood run cold. Reverend Samuel, the village priest, was being dragged by two attackers into the church. They had come for the heart of Zyke, its spiritual center. In a burst of courage, Emeka pushed himself to his feet and ran toward the church, shouting for help. "Reverend Samuel," he cried, fear choking his voice. But before he could reach the doors, a heavy blow struck him from behind. The world went black. Emeka awoke to a sharp pain in his head, his body sprawled on the cold, dusty floor of the church's entrance. The air smelled of smoke, and the sound of distant cries and screams filled the air. His heart raced as he tried to push himself up, his vision still blurry. The attack had been brutal, and he couldn't shake the image of Reverend Samuel being dragged into the church. He had to act fast. If the attackers were allowed to destroy the village's spiritual heart, there would be nothing left of Zyke. He staggered to his feet, his legs weak but determined. He pushed through the pain in his head and stepped cautiously toward the back of the church, where he had seen Reverend Samuel taken. The attackers had not yet made it to the inner sanctum, but Emeka could hear muffled voices inside, and the low, unsettling sound of someone being restrained. Emeka's breath quickened as he neared the door. He couldn't fight all of them alone, he wasn't a fighter. But his love for the village and his faith in the reverence of the church kept him going. He had to save Reverend Samuel and stop this madness before it spread further. Just as Emeka was about to reach the door, a familiar voice rang out. It was Usman, shouting in the distance. Emeka turned toward the sound, his heart skipping a beat. Usman was alive. He ran toward the sound of Usman's voice and found him standing with several other villagers, armed with makeshift weapons, sticks, hoes, and even farming tools. They had banded together, all determined to protect their home. The two men locked eyes, their previous tension forgotten in the heat of the moment. Usman was breathing heavily, his hands covered in dirt from his struggle. His expression was one of resolve, mixed with something deeper, regret, perhaps. "Emeka!" Usman shouted, running toward him. "It's not the herders, it's not just them. They've been manipulated. These men, they're not who they claim to be." Emeka's eyes widened. "What do you mean? Who are they, then?" Usman looked toward the village's edge, where several attackers were still wreaking havoc. "They're criminals, mercenaries. They've been hired to stoke the flames between us, between the farmers and the herders. The violence benefits them. They're trying to provoke us all into a full-scale war." The realization hit Emeka like a cold wave. The conflict between the herders and the farmers had been manipulated by outside forces, criminals who were using the community's struggles to fuel their own agenda. Zyke wasn't just being attacked, it was being torn apart from the inside out. But there was no time to dwell on the shocking truth. They had to stop the violence before it spread further. The criminals were still in control of key areas of the village, and if Emeka and Usman didn't act fast, everything Zyke stood for would be lost. The two men rallied the villagers, using the knowledge of their land and community to organize a counterattack. They set traps in key areas, blocking off routes the attackers might use to escape. The criminals, caught off guard by the sudden resistance, struggled to regain control. It wasn't just Emeka and Usman anymore. Zyke's people were fighting back, fighting for their home, their community, and their future. As the battle raged on, Emeka found himself face to face with the gang leader, the man who had masterminded the chaos. The leader's scarred face twisted into a sneer, his machete gleaming in the dim light. "You think you can stop this?" the leader growled. Emeka stood tall, holding his ground. "We will stop it, because we have something you'll never understand: unity." With a swift movement, Emeka knocked the machete from the leader's hand, and the villagers, emboldened by his courage, rushed in to overpower the remaining attackers. The first rays of the morning sun broke through the smoke-filled sky, casting a pale light over the village of Zyke. The fires had been extinguished, and the sounds of battle had quieted. The air was heavy with both exhaustion and relief. Emeka stood at the edge of his field, watching as the villagers, bruised and battered, began to rebuild what had been lost in the chaos of the previous night. The community, once torn apart by suspicion and conflict, was now bound together by a shared experience that would forever change them. Emeka's heart swelled with gratitude as he glanced at Usman, who was working alongside him, repairing a damaged fence. The two men, once rivals, now stood side by side, as comrades in arms, having fought for the very land they both loved. Emeka could see the change in Usman's eyes. Gone was the quiet, distant herder, and in his place stood a man who had seen the destructive power of division and was determined never to let it tear them apart again. "You are right," Usman said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "We've wasted so much time fighting each other, while others take advantage of our pain." Emeka nodded. "We were blind, Usman. But we see now. It's not about who owns the land or who owns the cattle. It's about us, the people of Zyke, working together to protect what's ours." As the day went on, Emeka and Usman worked tirelessly to restore the damage caused by the attackers. The sound of tools and laughter slowly replaced the eerie silence that had followed the violence. Gradually, the village began to return to its former self. Farmers planted new crops, herders repaired their huts, and the children, free from the fear that had haunted them, played in the streets once more. At the center of the village, Reverend Samuel, though still recovering from his injuries, gathered the community together. His voice, weak but unwavering, rang out as he addressed the villagers. "This is not just a victory over those who came to destroy us," he said, his eyes scanning the faces of the people he had always served. "This is a victory over the fear and suspicion that we've allowed to take root in our hearts. Today, we begin a new chapter. We build not just with bricks and wood, but with trust and unity." Emeka stood near the front, watching Reverend Samuel speak. His thoughts turned to the future. What would Zyke look like now? Would they truly change, or would the old habits of division and mistrust creep back in? He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was certain: Zyke had been given a second chance. And this time, Emeka was determined to make it last. The community didn't waste time. They knew that they had been given a rare opportunity, a chance to rebuild not just their homes, but their relationships. Usman and Emeka, together with the elders, initiated discussions about sustainable land use, grazing areas, and crop protection. The farmers and herders, once divided by suspicion, now began to negotiate in good faith, recognizing that their futures were intertwined. The land, their shared resource, would no longer be a point of contention but a bond. Later that evening, as the village settled into the warmth of the firelight, Emeka and Usman sat together, sharing a quiet moment of reflection. "You know," Emeka said, looking around the village, "I never thought we'd come to this. I always thought it was us versus them. But now, I see that it's just us. Zyke." Usman smiled, the weight of the past night lifting off his shoulders. "Yes, Zyke. Together, we'll make it work." The events of that fateful night had taught Zyke's people a valuable lesson: unity was their greatest strength. No matter how deep the divisions, no matter how strong the external forces trying to tear them apart, Zyke's true power lay in its people's ability to come together. The experience had shown them that when fear and suspicion gave way to trust and understanding, even the most fragile community could withstand the strongest storms. Zyke had been saved not by the strength of its warriors, but by the courage of its people to put aside their differences and fight for a common cause. And as the village began to heal, they realized that peace wasn't a mere absence of conflict, it was the active creation of a future where everyone had a place, and where every person, no matter their background or occupation, could find value and respect.